The old station wagon pulled up to the iron gates of Ashford Academy, and for a moment Daniel just sat there staring. He'd seen pictures of the school online, but nothing prepared him for the real thing. The building looked more like a castle than a high school, with its stone walls and towers reaching up into the gray morning sky. His social worker, Mrs. Patterson, gave him an encouraging smile from the driver's seat. "You ready for this?" she asked gently. Daniel nodded, even though his stomach was doing flips. He grabbed his duffel bag from the back seat. Everything he owned fit into that one bag. Clothes, a few books, and the small electronic keyboard that had been donated to his group home 3 years ago. That keyboard had changed his life, though he didn't know it at the time. Walking through those gates felt like entering a different world. Students were everywhere, laughing and hugging each other after the summer break. Daniel noticed their clothes first. Not the brands exactly, but the way everything looked new and perfectly fitted. The girls had designer bags hanging from their shoulders. The boys wore watches that probably cost more than a year of groceries. He found his way to the administration office, where a stern woman with glasses handed him his schedule and a map of the campus. She barely looked at him while explaining the rules. Daniel got the feeling she'd given this speech 100 times before and couldn't care less about number 101. His first class was English literature. He slipped into a seat at the back, hoping to go unnoticed. That strategy lasted exactly 10 minutes until the teacher, Mr. Brennan, asked everyone to introduce themselves and share something interesting about their summer. The stories that followed were like something out of a movie. One girl had spent July in the French Riviera. A boy talked about his family's yacht trip through the Caribbean. Another student casually mentioned attending a film premiere in Los Angeles because his uncle was a producer. When it was Daniel's turn, he simply said he'd spent the summer reading and practicing piano. He left out the part about the group home, the cramped bedroom he shared with 2 other boys, and the community center where he'd volunteered just to have somewhere to go during the day. By lunchtime, Daniel's head was spinning. The cafeteria was nothing like his old school. There were multiple food stations serving everything from sushi to gourmet sandwiches. Students sat in obvious groups, territories marked as clearly as if they'd drawn lines on the floor. He grabbed a tray and found an empty table in the corner. That's when he overheard the conversation at the next table. 3 boys were talking loudly, clearly not caring who heard them. "Did you see the scholarship kid?" one of them said with a smirk. "Showed up with everything in one bag. One bag. I have more luggage for a weekend trip. My dad says they have to let in a certain number of charity cases now," another replied. "Good publicity or something. Makes the school look charitable." The third boy laughed. "As long as they stay out of our way, right?" Daniel kept his eyes on his food, his appetite suddenly gone. He'd dealt with this before. Every new school, every new foster home, there was always someone ready to remind him he didn't belong. He'd learned to tune it out, mostly. The afternoon brought music class, and Daniel felt his nerves kick up again. Music was the one thing he was good at, the one place he could forget about everything else. When he sat down at the piano during his old school's talent show 2 years ago, something magical had happened. His fingers found the keys like they were coming home. He taught himself to play using free YouTube tutorials and a borrowed library book about music theory. That performance had changed everything. A teacher in the audience had connections to Ashford Academy's music program. She'd made some calls, pulled some strings, and suddenly Daniel had a full scholarship offer sitting in front of him. It felt like a miracle, a way out, a chance at something better. The music teacher, Professor Whitmore, was a tall woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She had the kind of face that looked like it rarely smiled. She went through the syllabus quickly, mentioning the upcoming regional young musicians competition that students were encouraged to enter. "We have a legacy of excellence in this program," she said, her voice sharp and clear. "Ashford Academy has produced concert pianists, composers, and music educators. I expect nothing less than complete dedication from each of you." Then she asked if anyone wanted to demonstrate their skill level. The room went silent. Daniel kept his head down, but his heart was racing. He wanted to play. His fingers were practically itching to touch those keys, but he also didn't want to draw more attention to himself on his first day. "No volunteers?" Professor Whitmore said, scanning the room. "Then I'll choose. You, the new student. Let's hear what earned you that scholarship." Every head in the room turned toward Daniel. He felt heat creep up his neck as he stood and walked to the grand piano at the front of the class. It was beautiful. Nothing like the dinged-up keyboards he'd practiced on before. He sat down on the bench, took a breath, and let his fingers find the keys. He played Chopin, a nocturne he'd memorized months ago. At first his fingers felt stiff, nervous, but then the music took over, the way it always did. The notes flowed out, filling the room with something soft and sad and beautiful all at once. He forgot about the other students watching. He forgot about the whispered comments at lunch. For 3 minutes there was only the music. When he finished, the room was completely silent. Daniel looked up, worried he'd messed up somehow. But Professor Whitmore's expression had changed. Her eyes were slightly wider, and something that might have been surprise flickered across her face. "Well," she said slowly, "that was quite competent. You'll do for the program." Coming from her, Daniel sensed that might actually be high praise. A few students were whispering to each other. He caught fragments as he walked back to his seat. Where did he learn to play like that? Self-taught? No way, but not everyone was impressed. Daniel noticed a blond boy in the front row wearing an expensive polo shirt. His arms were crossed, and he was staring at Daniel with an expression that wasn't friendly. There was something cold in his eyes, something calculating. After class, Daniel learned his name was Preston Hartwell. The Hartwell family had donated the school's concert hall 15 years ago. Preston's photo was on the wall outside the music room, showing him shaking hands with the governor at some youth music competition. Below the photo was a plaque listing his awards and achievements. As Daniel stood there looking at the wall of fame, Preston walked past with 2 friends. "Enjoy your moment," Preston said quietly, just loud enough for Daniel to hear. "Trust me, it won't last long around here." Daniel watched him walk away, his earlier nervousness replaced by something heavier. He'd been in enough tough situations to recognize a threat when he heard one. Preston wasn't just some spoiled rich kid. He was someone used to being the best, used to getting what he wanted, and Daniel had just become a problem that needed solving. Walking back to his assigned dorm room that evening, Daniel's head was full of competing thoughts. The campus was beautiful in the fading sunlight, all amber light and long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns. Students walked in groups, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Daniel walked alone, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder. This was his chance, maybe his only chance, to build something better for himself. Music could be his way forward, his ticket to college, to a future that didn't involve bouncing between foster homes and wondering where he'd end up next. He couldn't let anything mess this up. But as he climbed the stairs to his room, Preston's words echoed in his mind. Something told him that his biggest challenge at Ashford Academy wouldn't be the coursework or fitting in with wealthy classmates. It would be surviving whatever Preston had planned for him. The scholarship had gotten him through the gates. Now he had to figure out how to stay. The first 2 weeks at Ashford Academy passed in a blur of classes, homework, and trying to navigate a world Daniel didn't quite understand. He kept to himself mostly, eating lunch alone and heading straight to his dorm after classes. The other scholarship students were friendly enough, but they had their own struggles fitting in. Everyone was just trying to survive. Daniel lived for music class. 3 times a week he got to lose himself in the piano, and for those precious minutes nothing else mattered. Professor Whitmore had announced the Regional Young Musicians competition was open for entries, and Daniel knew this was his shot. Winning or even placing well could mean scholarship opportunities for college. It could mean a future, but there was a problem. Practice time. The school had 6 practice rooms in the music building, and they operated on a reservation system. Students could book slots online through the school portal. Daniel tried to reserve his usual evening time slot one Monday, only to find it was already taken. He tried Tuesday, also booked. Wednesday through Sunday, every single slot that worked with his schedule showed as unavailable. He approached Professor Whitmore after class, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "All the practice rooms are booked when I'm free," he explained. "Is there any way to add more time slots?" She looked at him over her reading glasses. "The system is first come, first served. Perhaps you need to plan further ahead. I tried booking for next week. Those are full too." Professor Whitmore's expression remained neutral. "Then I suggest you wake up earlier. The morning slots tend to be less popular." Daniel left her office feeling defeated. He checked the reservation system again that night. Someone, or multiple someones, had block booked every available practice room for the next 3 weeks during reasonable hours. The only open slots were at 5 in the morning or after 10 at night, when the building was supposed to be closed. He didn't have proof, but he had a pretty good idea who was behind it. Preston had made his presence known in small ways since that first day. A shoulder bump in the hallway that seemed accidental but wasn't. Comments just loud enough for Daniel to hear about charity cases and people who don't belong. His friends followed his lead, creating an invisible wall of hostility wherever Daniel went. Without access to practice rooms, Daniel got creative. He drew a piano keyboard on a large piece of cardboard, marking each key carefully. In his dorm room, he practiced with the sound off on his small electronic keyboard, his fingers moving through the pieces he'd memorized. It wasn't the same as playing a real piano, but it was better than nothing. He could feel the music in his head, hear each note in his mind, but he knew it wasn't enough. The competition was in 2 weeks. He needed real practice time on a real piano. That's when Preston approached him. It was a Thursday afternoon, and Daniel was sitting alone in the library, reviewing sheet music for his competition piece. Preston walked up with 2 of his friends, wearing an expression that almost looked friendly. Almost. "Hey, can we talk?" Preston asked, sliding into the chair across from Daniel. Daniel looked up, immediately suspicious. "About what?" "Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot," Preston said, and he actually sounded sincere. "I've been thinking about it, and I feel bad about how some people have been treating you. The practice room thing especially. You know about that?" Preston shrugged. "People talk, and honestly, it's not fair. You've got the competition coming up, and you need practice time just like everyone else." Daniel waited, knowing there had to be more. "So here's the thing," Preston continued, leaning forward. "My family owns a lot of property around here. There's this old building behind the theater. Used to be a music studio before they built the new wing. There's still a piano in there. Not the best, but it's decent enough for practice. I could give you a key." "Why would you do that?" Daniel asked directly. Preston's friends shifted uncomfortably, but Preston maintained his earnest expression. "Because it's the right thing to do. And honestly, I respect talent when I see it. That day you played in class, you were good. Really good. If you're going to compete, you should at least have a fair shot." Daniel studied Preston's face, looking for the trick, the catch. But Preston seemed genuine, even a little embarrassed by his own generosity. "The building's not used anymore, so nobody will bother you," Preston added. "You can practice whenever you want. No reservation system, no competition for time slots. Just show up and play." It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it was. But Daniel was desperate. The competition was approaching fast, and his cardboard keyboard wasn't cutting it. His fingers needed to feel real keys, needed to build the muscle memory that only came from actual practice. "Why that building?" Daniel asked. "Why not just help me get time in the regular practice rooms?" "Because those are all booked, man," Preston said with a laugh. "Trust me, I tried to pull some strings for you, but Professor Whitmore is strict about the reservation system. This is easier. And honestly, it's probably better. You'll have complete privacy, no time limits, no interruptions." One of Preston's friends, a tall kid named Blake, spoke up. "It's actually pretty cool in there. Old school vibe, you know? Kind of romantic, like where a real artist would practice." Daniel's gut told him to say no, to walk away. But his brain did the math. 2 weeks until the competition. 0 practice time on a real piano. This might be his only option. "Can I see it first?" Daniel asked. "Sure," Preston said, standing up. "Come on, I'll show you right now." They walked across campus, past the main academic buildings and the theater. Behind it stood an old brick structure that looked like it hadn't been used in years. Preston pulled out a key and unlocked the heavy door. Inside, it smelled like dust and old wood. But there, in the corner of what must have once been a practice studio, sat an upright piano. Daniel approached it slowly. The wood was scratched and faded, and some of the keys looked yellowed with age. He pressed middle C. The sound that came out was thin but real. He played a quick scale. A few notes sounded off, out of tune, but most worked. "Told you," Preston said, jingling the key. "Not perfect, but it'll do the job, right?" Daniel played a few bars of his competition piece. Something felt weird about the piano, the way some keys responded differently than others. But after 2 weeks of practicing on cardboard and silence, even a mediocre piano felt like a gift. "So you want the key or not?" Preston asked. No pressure either way. Daniel looked at the piano, then at Preston, then back at the piano. Every instinct screamed that this was a setup, But what choice did he have? Go into the competition completely unprepared? Give up his one chance at a better future? Yeah, Daniel said finally. I'll take it. Preston handed over the key with a smile. Great, it's all yours. Practice as much as you want. And hey, good luck with the competition. May the best musician win. As they walked back toward the main campus, Preston and his friends were chatting and laughing like old friends. Daniel trailed slightly behind, the key heavy in his pocket. He wanted to believe this was genuine, that Preston had actually decided to be decent. But something in his chest felt tight, like a warning he couldn't quite translate into words. That night, Daniel returned to the old building alone. He sat at the piano and began to practice his competition piece, a sonata he'd fallen in love with months ago. But the piano felt wrong under his fingers. Some keys stuck slightly. Others produced sounds that didn't quite match what they should. A few keys in the upper register made no sound at all. He told himself it was just an old instrument, poorly maintained. He'd work around it. He'd adjust. He had no other choice. What Daniel didn't see was the tiny camera hidden in the corner of the room, its red recording light barely visible in the dim space. And he didn't know that 3 buildings away, Preston and his friends were sitting in a dorm room watching a laptop screen, watching Daniel struggle with the deliberately sabotaged piano, and laughing. Daniel spent the next 3 days living at that old piano. He'd finish his classes, grab a quick dinner, and head straight to the abandoned building. Every evening he'd unlock that heavy door and sit down at the broken instrument, trying to make sense of what his fingers were telling him. The piano was worse than he'd first thought. It wasn't just out of tune. Something was fundamentally wrong with it. The C sharp in the middle octave produced a sound like a dying cat. The F above middle C made no sound at all, just a dull thunk when he pressed it. The keys themselves felt inconsistent, some sticking halfway down, others bouncing back too quickly. He tried everything he could think of. He adjusted his hand position. He played softer, then harder. He compensated for the dead keys by shifting parts of the melody to other octaves. But no matter what he did, his competition piece sounded like a mess. What should have been beautiful came out choppy and strange, like a conversation with half the words missing. By the 3rd night, frustration had turned into something closer to despair. The competition was now just days away. He'd wasted almost a week on this worthless piano while Preston and everyone else practiced on proper instruments. Daniel put his head in his hands, elbows resting on the yellowed keys, and let himself feel the weight of it all. That's when he noticed it. A tiny red light, barely visible in the corner near the ceiling. It blinked once, then stayed solid. Daniel's heart started pounding. He stood up slowly, walked closer, squinting in the dim light. There, tucked behind an old light fixture, was a small camera pointed directly at the piano. His stomach dropped. He felt sick. It all made sense now. Preston's sudden kindness. The convenient solution to his practice room problem. The key handed over so easily. This wasn't help. It was a trap. They'd been watching him struggle, recording his frustration, probably laughing at every mistake and every moment of confusion. Daniel's first instinct was to storm out, to find Preston and confront him. His second instinct was to report it to Professor Whitmore or the administration. But as he stood there staring at that little red light, a different feeling settled over him. It was cold and clear and sharp. They wanted him to fail. They wanted to break his confidence, to prove he didn't belong here. And if he reacted now, if he made a scene or complained, he'd just be the scholarship kid causing drama. They'd probably already prepared their defense. Just a prank. Learn to take a joke. Can't handle the pressure. No, there had to be a better way. Daniel sat back down at the piano, very aware of the camera watching him. He played through his piece again, deliberately looking frustrated. He shook his head, rubbed his face, played the same difficult passage over and over like someone desperately trying to figure out what was wrong. He was giving them exactly what they wanted to see. But inside, his mind was working on something else entirely. He left the building that night looking defeated, shoulders slumped, dragging his feet. If anyone was watching, he wanted them to see a kid who was giving up. He wanted Preston to feel confident, secure in his victory. The next morning, Daniel woke up at 4:30. The campus was completely dark and silent as he made his way to the music building. He'd done some research the night before and discovered that the janitor, Mr. Chen, started his shift at 5. Daniel waited by the back entrance, shivering in the early morning cold. When Mr. Chen arrived, Daniel explained his situation. Not the camera or the sabotage, just that he needed practice time and all the slots were full. Mr. Chen was a quiet man in his 60s who'd worked at Ashford for 20 years. He'd seen plenty of scholarship kids come through, and he recognized the look of someone fighting an uphill battle. "You can come in mornings," Mr. Chen said simply, unlocking the door. "I won't tell anyone, but you leave the rooms exactly as you found them." "I will. Thank you. Thank you so much." From that day on, Daniel lived on a new schedule. He'd practice in the real music building from 5 to 7 in the morning, when he had his pick of the best pianos and complete silence to focus. Then he'd grab breakfast, go to classes, and in the evening, he'd return to the broken piano in the abandoned building to put on a show for Preston's camera. The morning practices were intense. Daniel poured everything into those 2 hours. His competition piece was a sonata that told a story, moving from darkness into light, from struggle to triumph. He'd chosen it months ago because it felt like his own life set to music. Now, with everything that had happened, it meant even more. But something unexpected happened during those morning sessions. After spending days on that sabotaged piano, playing on a proper instrument felt almost too easy. His fingers knew exactly where to go and how hard to press. He'd memorized every note so thoroughly that he could have played it in his sleep. The compensation techniques he'd developed, the way he'd learned to trust his internal sense of the music, rather than relying on the sound, had actually sharpened his skills. He started doing something unusual. He'd practice parts of his piece with his eyes closed, trusting only muscle memory and his understanding of the music's structure. He'd play sections incredibly soft, barely pressing the keys, then at full power. He experimented with timing, with dynamics, with the emotional weight of each phrase. In the evenings, he'd return to the broken piano and continue his performance of frustration. He'd play sections wrong on purpose, stop and start, even occasionally pound the keys in mock anger. He imagined Preston and his friends watching, imagined their smug satisfaction, and he fed that into his motivation. 1 week before the competition, something shifted. Daniel was alone in the music building at dawn, playing through his piece for what felt like the 100th time. But this time it wasn't practice anymore. It was something else. The music flowed out of him like water, natural and inevitable. He wasn't thinking about the notes or the technique. He was living inside the story the composer had created, feeling every emotion, every transition. When he finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. His hands were shaking slightly, not from nervousness, but from the intensity of what had just happened. He'd connected with the music in a way he never had before. All those early mornings, all that anger and determination, all those hours on a broken piano teaching himself to trust his instincts, it had all led to this. Mr. Chen was mopping the hallway when Daniel emerged from the practice room. The older man looked at him and nodded slowly, a small smile on his weathered face. "Sounded good in there," he said quietly. "Thank you for everything. You keep working like that and you'll do fine." That evening, Daniel went to the abandoned building one last time. He sat at the broken piano and played his piece through, knowing the camera was recording every note. But this time he didn't fake frustration. He played it perfectly, or as perfectly as anyone could on an instrument with missing notes and broken keys. He compensated, adjusted, and improvised around every problem. When he finished, he looked directly at the camera and smiled. Not a friendly smile, a smile that said, "I know exactly what you did, and it didn't work." He left the key on top of the piano and walked out, closing the door behind him for the last time. The competition was in 3 days. Preston thought he'd broken Daniel's confidence and sabotaged his preparation. What Preston didn't know was that he'd accidentally given Daniel something more valuable than any practice room. He'd given him a reason to dig deeper than he ever had before, to push harder, to want victory not just for himself, but to prove that cruelty didn't win. Daniel walked back to his dorm through the dark campus, and for the first time in weeks he felt ready. Not just ready to compete, ready to win. The morning of the regional young musicians competition arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. Daniel woke up at 6, even though the competition didn't start until 2 in the afternoon. Sleep had been impossible anyway. He'd spent most of the night staring at the ceiling, running through his piece in his head, feeling his fingers move against the blanket like he was playing invisible keys. The competition was being held at Ashford Academy, in the concert hall that had Preston's family name engraved on a gold plaque by the entrance. Students from 12 different schools would be competing, each one bringing their best performers. The local newspaper was sending a photographer. Parents had been talking about it for weeks. For Preston, this was supposed to be his coronation, another trophy to add to his collection. Daniel got dressed carefully. Mr. Chen had lent him a suit, navy blue and only slightly too big in the shoulders. It was the nicest thing Daniel had ever worn. He stood in front of the small mirror in his dorm room, hardly recognizing himself. He looked like someone who belonged here, like someone who had every right to be on that stage. By noon, the concert hall was buzzing with activity. Performers were warming up in practice rooms. Parents filled the lobby, talking in clusters and taking photos. Daniel walked through it all feeling strangely calm. He'd expected to be nervous, terrified even. But after everything he'd been through, the competition itself almost felt easy. He saw Preston in the hallway outside the main auditorium, surrounded by his parents and what looked like a private instructor giving last-minute advice. Preston's father was tall and silver-haired, wearing a suit that probably cost more than a semester's tuition. His mother had the kind of jewelry that caught the light with every movement. They looked like people who were used to winning, who expected it as naturally as breathing. Preston spotted Daniel and his expression flickered with something, surprise maybe, or confusion. He'd probably expected Daniel to look defeated, nervous, unprepared. Instead, Daniel met his eyes steadily and nodded once before walking past. He caught the uncertainty on Preston's face and felt a small surge of satisfaction. The competition format was straightforward. Each performer would play one piece no longer than 8 minutes. 3 judges sat at a table in the front row, all of them professional musicians from the city. The audience filled the rest of the seats, maybe 200 people total. The atmosphere felt heavy with expectation. Daniel drew number 17 out of 22 performers. Preston was number 4. When Preston's name was called, the applause was immediate and enthusiastic. He walked onto the stage with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. He wore an expensive black suit, and even the way he sat at the piano looked practiced and perfect. His parents beamed from the 3rd row. Preston began to play Rachmaninoff, a notoriously difficult piece full of complex runs and powerful chords. And he played it well. His technique was flawless, every note precise and clean. His hands moved across the keys with the kind of ease that only came from years of expensive lessons and constant practice. When he finished, the applause was strong. His parents stood up immediately, clapping hard. The judges wrote notes with serious expressions. Daniel watched from backstage and had to admit it was an impressive performance. Preston was good, really good, but something about it felt cold, mechanical. It was like watching a machine that had been programmed to perfection. All the notes were right, but something was missing. The next 12 performers were a mixed group. Some were excellent, some were merely okay. A girl from Westbrook Prep played Debussy beautifully. A boy from Lincoln Academy stumbled through Chopin and looked close to tears when he finished. Each performance added to the weight of anticipation in the room. Finally, number 17 was called, Daniel Chen, performing Beethoven's Sonata No. 8. The Pathétique. Daniel stood up and his heart was suddenly pounding. All that calm from earlier evaporated in an instant. He walked onto the stage and the lights were brighter than he'd expected. He could see faces in the audience, could feel 200 pairs of eyes focused on him. He heard whispers, probably people asking who he was, which school he represented. He sat at the grand piano, adjusted the bench, and looked at the keys. They gleamed under the stage lights, perfect and pristine. His hands were shaking slightly. He took a breath, then another. Then he looked up and saw Mr. Chen standing in the back of the auditorium. The janitor had taken time off work to come watch. He gave Daniel a small nod, and somehow that helped more than anything else could have. Daniel placed his fingers on the keys and closed his eyes for just a moment. He thought about every foster home he'd lived in, every time someone had told him he wasn't good enough, every closed door and missed opportunity. He thought about that broken piano and Preston's camera. He thought about those early morning practice sessions when the whole world was asleep and it was just him and the music. Then he began to play. The pathétique started soft and sad, the opening notes falling like gentle rain. Daniel let himself sink into it, let the story of the piece take over. He wasn't performing anymore. He was living inside the music, feeling every emotion Beethoven had put into those notes 200 years ago. The first movement moved from melancholy to something more urgent, more desperate. Daniel's fingers flew across the keys, but it wasn't about speed or showing off technique. It was about the journey, about expressing something too deep for words. Every note meant something. He could feel when the audience shifted, when they stopped being polite listeners and became truly engaged. The energy in the room changed. People leaned forward in their seats. The whispers stopped completely. The second movement brought a brief moment of peace, a melody that felt like hope breaking through darkness. Daniel played it with tenderness, each phrase shaped with care. He'd lived this part, knew what it felt like to find small moments of beauty in difficult circumstances. Then came the final movement, and Daniel let everything pour out. All his anger at being dismissed and underestimated, all his determination to prove he belonged here, all his love for music and what it had given him. The notes built and built, growing more intense, more powerful, until the final crashing chords resolved into silence. Daniel's hands hovered over the keys for a heartbeat, then he slowly lowered them to his lap. The auditorium was completely quiet. For a terrible moment he thought he'd messed up somehow, that the silence meant he'd failed. Then the applause started. It wasn't polite or measured. It exploded through the room like thunder. People stood up, not just a few, but entire rows of them. The judges were nodding to each other, writing rapidly on their scoring sheets. Daniel looked out at the audience and saw genuine emotion on faces, saw people wiping their eyes. Mr. Chen was clapping so hard his hands had to hurt. Even some of Preston's friends looked stunned, their mouths slightly open. Daniel stood and bowed, his legs feeling shaky. As he walked off stage, his ears were ringing from the applause. His hands were trembling now, adrenaline flooding through him. He'd done it. Whatever happened with the final scoring, he'd given everything he had. In the wings, other performers were staring at him with respect. A girl from another school whispered, "That was incredible," as he walked past. Daniel found a seat in the backstage area and put his head in his hands, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming rush of everything he'd just experienced. He'd spent so long preparing, fighting, proving himself, and now it was done. There were still 5 more performers after him, but Daniel barely heard them. His mind was replaying his own performance, analyzing every moment, wondering if he'd done enough. When the last performer finished, the judges huddled together for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15 minutes. The audience waited in hushed anticipation. Daniel could see Preston in the front section, his jaw tight, his parents looking less certain than they had earlier. Finally, the head judge, a woman with gray hair and kind eyes, approached the microphone with 3 envelopes. She gave a short speech about the quality of performances and the difficulty of judging such talented young musicians. Daniel's heart was beating so hard he thought everyone could probably hear it. "Third place," she announced, and it was the girl who'd played Debussy. Deserved, Daniel thought. She'd been wonderful. Second place. The judge paused for effect. Preston Hartwell, Ashford Academy. The applause was respectful but not overwhelming. Preston stood and accepted his ribbon with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Second place. For someone like him, who'd expected nothing less than victory, it might as well have been last place. Daniel's chest felt so tight he couldn't breathe. There was 1 envelope left, and first place, our regional young musicians competition winner. The judge smiled. "Daniel Chen, Ashford Academy." Daniel walked onto the stage in a daze. The applause sounded like it was coming from underwater, distant and unreal. The head judge handed him a trophy, heavier than he expected, with his name already engraved on a small gold plate. First place, Regional Young Musicians Competition. His name right there in metal, permanent and real. People were taking photos. The local newspaper photographer was gesturing for him to hold the trophy higher. Other performers were congratulating him, shaking his hand. But Daniel kept looking at that trophy, running his thumb over the engraved letters, making sure they were actually there. In the crowd, he could see Preston standing rigid, his second-place ribbon clutched in one hand. His parents were talking to him urgently, but Preston's eyes were locked on Daniel with an expression that was hard to read. Anger, definitely, but also something else. Disbelief, maybe. Like his entire understanding of how the world worked had just been challenged. The reception after the competition was held in the school's main gallery. Tables were set up with refreshments, and parents mingled with judges and school administrators. Daniel stood awkwardly by the wall, still holding his trophy, not sure what to do with himself. He'd never been to anything like this before. Everyone else seemed to know the unwritten rules of these events, who to talk to and how to network and make connections. Mrs. Patterson, his social worker, had come to watch. She found him in the corner and pulled him into a tight hug. "I knew you could do it," she said, and her eyes were wet with tears. "I'm so proud of you." "I couldn't have done it without you," Daniel said, and he meant it. She'd been the one to push him to apply for the scholarship, to believe that places like Ashford Academy could be for kids like him too. Several college recruiters approached Daniel during the reception, schools he'd only dreamed about, offering to talk about music scholarships and their programs. Each conversation felt surreal. These people were treating him like he mattered, like he had a future worth investing in. Professor Whitmore even came over. Her usual stern expression softened slightly. "That was a remarkable performance," she said simply. "You have real talent. I expect great things from you." Coming from her. Those words meant everything. But as the evening wore on, Daniel noticed Preston and his friends huddled in a corner, their phones out, looking at something and laughing quietly. Every few seconds, one of them would glance in Daniel's direction. That familiar feeling of unease crept back into his stomach. He excused himself from a conversation with a recruiter from Berklee College of Music and headed toward the bathroom. On the way, he passed close enough to Preston's group to hear fragments of their conversation. "Video is perfect. Post it. Tomorrow, everyone will see how he actually practiced." Daniel's blood ran cold. The camera. The footage from the broken piano. They were planning to release it, probably edited to make him look incompetent or foolish. Even though he'd won today, they were going to try to humiliate him anyway. They couldn't stand that he'd beaten them, so they'd try to tear down his victory. He kept walking, his mind racing. He could confront them, but what good would that do? They'd just deny it or claim it was a joke. He could report it, but by the time anyone investigated, the video would already be online, spreading across social media, becoming part of his permanent digital footprint. No, he needed to handle this differently. Daniel found Mr. Chen in the hallway, getting ready to leave. The janitor had stayed for the whole reception, keeping to the background but making sure Daniel knew he was there. "Mr. Chen, can I ask you something?" Daniel said quietly. "Do you know anything about the old building behind the theater? The one that used to be a music studio?" Mr. Chen's expression grew serious. "I know that building. Why?" Daniel explained everything. The practice room setup, Preston's offer of help, the sabotaged piano and the hidden camera. He even pulled out his phone and showed Mr. Chen the photos he'd secretly taken of the camera on his last visit to the building. Mr. Chen listened without interrupting, his face growing darker with each detail. "That's not just mean," he said finally. "That's harassment, maybe even illegal, recording someone without permission like that." "They're planning to post the video online," Daniel said. "I heard them talking about it just now." Mr. Chen was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he nodded slowly. "Come with me. We need to talk to someone." Within 20 minutes, they were sitting in the headmaster's office with Dean Richards, a woman in her 50s known for being fair but strict. Mr. Chen had explained the situation, and Daniel had shown her the photos and told her everything that had happened. Dean Richards listened with an expression that grew increasingly stern. When Daniel finished, she picked up her phone and made a call. "I need Preston Hartwell and Blake Morrison in my office immediately," she said into the phone. "Yes, right now. I don't care if they're at the reception. This is urgent." 10 minutes later, Preston and Blake arrived, looking confused and slightly annoyed at being pulled away from the event. Their expressions changed quickly when they saw Daniel and Mr. Chen sitting there. "Sit down," Dean Richards said, her voice cold. "I'm going to ask you this once, and I strongly suggest you tell the truth. Is there a camera hidden in the old music building behind the theater?" Preston's face went pale. Blake suddenly found the floor very interesting. We were just... Preston started, but his voice trailed off. "We have photos of the camera," Dean Richards said. "We have testimony about the damaged piano. And Mr. Chen informs me that he can access the building right now to verify everything. So I'll ask again, did you set up a camera to record Daniel without his knowledge? The silence stretched out. Finally, Preston nodded slightly. Why? Dean Richards asked, and there was genuine bewilderment in her voice. Why would you do something like this? Preston didn't answer. How could he explain that he couldn't stand being beaten by someone he considered beneath him? That his entire identity was wrapped up in being the best and Daniel's talent threatened that? Do you have the footage? The dean asked, another nod. On your phone? Another nod. Hand it over. Both of you. Phone's on my desk right now. Preston and Blake reluctantly placed their phones on the desk. Dean Richards picked them up and looked at both boys with an expression of deep disappointment. Here's what's going to happen, she said. First, this footage will be permanently deleted. I'll watch you do it, and then our IT department will verify it's gone from any cloud storage or backup systems. Second, you will both write letters of apology to Daniel. Third, there will be a formal disciplinary hearing to determine if further consequences are warranted. This kind of behavior is not tolerated at Ashford Academy, legacy family or not. Preston's father was called. The conversation that followed was intense and uncomfortable. To his credit, Mr. Hartwell seemed genuinely shocked and ashamed by his son's actions. The family legacy suddenly felt less like protection and more like added pressure. By the time Daniel left the dean's office, it was late evening. The reception had ended and the campus was quiet. He walked back to his dorm slowly, still processing everything that had happened in one impossible day. His phone buzzed. An email from the Berkeley recruiter, asking to schedule a meeting to discuss scholarship opportunities. Another email from a summer music program in New York inviting him to audition. Messages from classmates he barely knew congratulating him on his win. But the message that meant the most was a simple text from Mr. Chen. Proud of you, kid. You earned every bit of this. Daniel sat on his dorm room bed and finally let himself feel it all. The relief, the exhaustion, the joy, the satisfaction of knowing that he'd won not just the competition, but something bigger. He'd proven that talent and hard work could overcome privilege and cruelty. He'd shown that foster kids and scholarship students deserve to be here just as much as anyone else. The trophy sat on his desk, catching the light from his small lamp. First place, his name engraved in gold. 3 months later, Preston transferred to a different school. The disciplinary hearing had resulted in a suspension and mandatory community service, but more than that, he couldn't handle being at Ashford anymore. Every time he walked past the concert hall or saw Daniel in the hallway, he was reminded of his own worst impulses and their consequences. Daniel continued to thrive. He became a mentor for other scholarship students, helping them navigate the challenges of fitting into a world that wasn't designed for them. He gave a performance at the winter concert that received a standing ovation. And when college acceptance letters arrived in the spring, he had his pick of prestigious music programs, several offering full scholarships. Years later, when Daniel performed at Carnegie Hall for the first time, he would think back to that broken piano in the abandoned building. He'd think about how the cruelty meant to destroy him had actually made him stronger, more determined, more connected to the emotional depth of music. Because sometimes the worst things people do to us become the fuel for our greatest achievements. Sometimes being underestimated is the best motivation there is. And sometimes, just sometimes, the kids who aren't supposed to win end up writing their names in gold.